there was a responsibility on trustees and on senior leaders in the charity sector to make long-term decisions that will preserve these organisations into the future, but also make sure that they're going to be successful for the long term.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something far more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
So we make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change, basically all of the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies. It's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others.
In this episode, we're sharing our conversation with Mark Atkinson, who is Director General for Royal British Legion. In the conversation, Mark reflects on his first 100 days and beyond at Royal British Legion and shares his thoughts on how the charity sector has changed and continues to embrace change, or needs to continue to embrace change, in order to modernise and to stay relevant.
It's a great conversation. We really enjoyed talking to Mark, and as ever, he was super insightful. So we encourage you to listen to it and let us know what you think of it. And in digital-related news, Paul, I should wish you a happy International Podcast Day.
It's today, isn't it? Today,
it is indeed.
On the almost eve of our 75th episode with Mark. So that will be out on Thursday. So 2 days after we hit our 75th anniversary.
Happy anniversary. 75 episodes, over 80 guests. Wow, it does feel like a milestone.
It does, and all sorts of topics. Our intro talks about the shift that we've made in the content of the podcast, but we talk about 4 or 5 topics in our intro. But we just cover so much now these days, Zoe, and particularly with all of the authors and books that we've been privileged to have sent our way and introduced on the podcast too.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like there's an increasing amount of topics that leaders need to be across in 2024. That feels like a big development that we've seen since we started the podcast back in 2020. And on that note, we will be launching season 9 of our podcast in early 2025. We're already getting some very interesting guests coming to us with their ideas for what they would like to talk about on our podcast. So please do drop us a line if you're interested in being a guest. Contact me on zoe@zoeamar.com, and we would love to hear from you.
And if I could have one dream guest, and this would be one for you, Zoe, it would be Mikel Arteta, the manager of Arsenal Football Club.
Do you think it's likely that they'd come on? I mean, you could ask.
He barely talks to the media. I don't think he's ever going to come on to our podcast, quite frankly. And there are football-related podcasts where I've never heard him speak. So I would assume, although, to be honest, he might be sideswiped by the fact that we'd want to talk to him about leadership and not football necessarily. So there you go. We might as well give it a go.
Amazing. Well, you know that you've really made it as a leader when you can only very selectively give interviews, like Kate Moss.
Yeah, and maybe we'll pick up the pieces after the US election in November, and maybe the candidate that doesn't win through will come on the podcast and talk to us about why they didn't come through, and if that's Donald Trump, won't that be fun?
Maybe. I'm not sure we'd have him on as a guest, but yes, who knows what the next season holds. Hopefully some good guests who really share our values. So please do drop us a line if you're interested to come on the podcast. And also please do look out for an upcoming episode of the Akivo podcast. I recorded it this morning. Really enjoyed, as ever, talking to Jane Ide, CEO of Akivo, who we have had on as a guest previously, and also Adila Wally, who I'm a big fan of, CEO of Charity Comms. We were talking about a subject that we have discussed quite a lot on this podcast, actually, which is, should you stay, should you go on X, formerly known as Twitter. What should leaders do? What should organizations do? And one of the things we talked about actually was podcasts, and how I've been hearing from more CEOs recently who are interested in being on podcasts and what to do about tackling that channel, and how it might mean they need to develop their skill set and the way they think about content. So maybe that's something we will come back to in a future episode as well.
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah, certainly more coming on, and it's not always clear to people how they should approach a podcast interview. So yeah, I think that's a good one. We should definitely do it.
Excellent. Right. And now, speaking of leadership, to a man who needs no introduction, we enjoyed talking to Mark Atkinson, who's Director General of the Royal British Legion. This is a really thought-provoking conversation about leadership and where the sector is going next. Mark Atkinson. We are super excited to welcome Mark Atkinson to Starts at the Top. Mark Atkinson was appointed Director General for Royal British Legion in January 2024. He spent most of his working life in social sector organisations, leading business change, refocus and growth with charities that are ambitious about making a positive impact. Mark started his career in communications, marketing and advocacy roles for the local government association, Citizens Advice, Youth Sport Trust and Ambitious About Autism. Before starting at Royal British Legion, he was Chief Executive at the Royal National Institute for Deaf People, RNID, where he redefined their strategy and restored the name of the charity to RNID after a challenging previous 10 years when they were known as Action on Hearing Loss. Before RNID, he spent 5 years at the disability equality charity Scope, latterly as the CEO, leading them through a period of significant change, which we'll be talking a bit more about today. Outside of work, Mark is Vice Chair and Senior Independent Director of Hub Intake, a housing association that supports disabled people to live independently and create inclusive communities. Mark is originally from Lancaster and studied at Columbia Business School in New York. In his spare time, he enjoys running, walking in the countryside and cooking. Mark, welcome to Starts at the Top. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for making the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm really excited as well, although I feel slightly embarrassed because I think that biography was written a little while ago and I haven't been running for a while, so I'm feeling guilty already. I need to get out and go for a run. But yes, it's really nice to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. And you're not alone in that. Paul had a bit of a break from running recently. We've all been there. And you've been very busy, haven't you? Obviously. So let's talk about that then, because when we spoke a few months ago, when we were planning this conversation together, we were talking about those first 100 days in that new job. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's been like and how it's been for you?
Well, I'm almost 6 months in, so I
Congratulations.
started in January of this year. So yeah, almost 6 months in, so a bit more than 100 days now. But I guess, it's been a reminder for me that actually changing jobs is a kind of equal measure of being demanding and exciting and daunting, kind of all in one go. So, I spent 5 years, as you said, at RNID and 5 years at Scope before that. So it's been a while since I've started a new job. And I guess the kind of key thing is that this is in a slightly different bit of the charity sector. So I've spent the last 15 years working in disability and health organisations. And now I'm in a whole different world where I'm trying to learn about the armed forces community, understand that policy agenda, build credibility with the Ministry of Defence, and actually really difficultly, learning a whole new kind of language, the whole new kind of way of speaking, vocabulary, acronyms, etc. So look, it's been great. It's been 6 months. It's been incredibly busy. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, but I wouldn't for a minute kind of pretend it's not challenging and difficult, because starting new jobs is tough. But yeah, no, it's been really great so far. Thank you.
And what do you find most challenging about it? Well, obviously, you're a highly experienced CEO. You've worked with all these amazing organisations. What do you find most challenging about that change when you're taking on a new role?
Yeah, I mean, look, you sort of join organisations and they're mid-flight, right? They're doing stuff today and they're living and breathing, and there are people that work there or volunteer there, and there are kind of communities that you're working with. So there's a kind of an immediate need to try and work out how to add some value. You've been hired, you've got a reputation, you want to add some value to the organisation. So I think doing that, is obviously the immediate priority. But at the same time, thinking about, the gaps in your knowledge or the experience that you've got, and how do you kind of quickly learn so that you can kind of hit the ground running. So you're kind of constantly balancing those things, which is wanting to learn but wanting to add value. And I think also trying to carve out some time to think about the future. This organisation, the Royal British Legion's been around 103, 104 years, really rich history, very well known, very highly trusted. But where do we take it, and what do we do with it, and how do we achieve change so that it's impactful in the future? I mean, so trying to create some time when you start a new job to think about the future is really important as well. Otherwise, you very quickly get institutionalized and become part of running the organization as it is. And so I've tried quite hard to think about my time, Zoe, and how I spend that, and working out where I can add some value and actually where I can't add some value, and I need to kind of step back and let others carry on.
And speaking of thinking about the future, you mentioned before we started recording today that you're beginning to work on the organisation's new strategy. Can you tell us a bit more about where you're at?
Yeah, so we're just about to get going. At the end of this month, we've got some time with our trustees. So this will be familiar to many people listening to this podcast, sitting down with the charity trustees. And I think, my job is to encourage them to think outside of the box and to think differently about the organisation and where it might go. And, people have different views on strategy, and there's, thousands of textbooks that have been written. But I think the two key things that I've learned, having worked on strategy with Scope and R&ID, is firstly, strategy is ultimately about making choices. It's about making decisions. And I don't think a good strategy is one where you say, let's carry on doing all the things we've always done, but a little bit better or a little bit more efficient, please. Strategy is about choice. It's about working out what the 2 or 3 really dominant tasks are that you need to put your energy and resource behind in order to have the most possible impact for your community. But, secondly, it's about working out what the future is, and, having a strategy that takes your organisation to a place that it wouldn't naturally have got to, and making sure that you're fit for the future needs and the future kind of demands that people have. And so for me, going into this sort of strategy conversation with my trustees at the Royal British Legion, that's the kind of the two things I'm going to push hard on, which is we've got to make some choices, and we've got to work out what the future is and position this organisation in that future state. And it's tough, right? Because all of these organisations in our sector have kind of grown up organically. Many of them do brilliant things that they've been doing for many years, and they've been kind of added on, at different points where there have been gaps in the state or gaps in terms of what other organisations provide. But the real challenge is, how do you take an organisation with such heritage and history and, all of that stuff, and, sensitively and diplomatically move it into, a very different place. So, yeah, we're about to start that conversation. I guess the other thing we've been having a good debate about is at what pace do you do strategy? It's quite an interesting question, because I think it is possible to, lock yourself away in a hotel somewhere with your trustees and, do some work for a few days and come out with a blueprint. I think there is real value in going at a more moderate pace, because that allows you to be much more evidential, and it allows you to kind of involve key partners, whether that's your staff or your volunteers or your, the community that you're working with or the people that fund your work. So, I've agreed with my board that we're going to probably start later this month and take sort of 6 to 9 months, that sort of territory, that sort of time frame, to get some real definition on the organisation that we want to be, and to get some real specificity around that. And then maybe the same sort of period of time, maybe another sort of 9 months or so, on defining operating model and how you create an organisation that's fit for that purpose. But I think, there is a risk, and you see this in our sector, of organisations either going too slow or too fast. And that, ultimately that's a kind of a judgment on strategy pace. But I think 6 to 9 months feels about right for an organisation like the Royal British Legion.
I was going to ask about that, the sort of the incremental change versus the short, sharp shock change, which obviously that can sometimes be where, at the transition point where a new CEO comes in. But incremental change seems to make more sense to me as somebody looking from the outside in for an organisation like the Royal British Legion. Do you think you have the right balance within the trustee group to be able to do that with them, or do you think they, in some ways, do need to be challenged as a group of people around fast
Yeah.
change?
So it's a good question, Paul. I mean, I think just stepping back a little bit, one of my reflections, having spent all of my career working in charities, I'm not somebody who's moved sectors, but one of my reflections, having been in this world for some time, is that there's a lot of talk of transformation. We're going through a big transformation, and I kind of question, why is that the case? Why are charities doing lots of transformation? And I guess one hypothesis is because we're not good at what you're describing, which is the kind of always on iterative change, reflecting on new evidence, new data, new customer or supporter needs, and in a sort of agile way, constantly adapting the charity so that it's fit for purpose. I don't see a lot of that in our sector. There are some examples, but I don't see a lot of it. And therefore, what happens is I think organisations become very focused on the here and the now and delivering today and managing the risks and constraints that they're experiencing today. And then periodically, because there's a new chief executive or there's a new chair of the board or something happens, they think about strategy and transformation. And I guess I'm quite interested in how do we break that cycle? How do we become, organizations that are always doing iterative change, always thinking, how can we be slightly better? How can we deliver more? How can we kind of stretch our impact further? And we're certainly not in that place at the Royal British Legion. We're about to go into a big period of strategy, thinking and development. And out of that will come a big transformation programme. But after that, I really hope we can get into a place where we're constantly thinking about iterative change and how we can nudge things, shift the dial slightly all the time about the impact that we're having. So, look, I think it's a really good question because, as I say, charities are notorious for talking about transformation in a way that I'm not sure we always see in other sectors where they're possibly a bit more mature about organisational change.
Well, I work a lot in the financial and accountancy sector, and that never changes. So
Right.
they really do need to be forced sometimes to make those changes. But you then get to a point where you are introducing some of those tools and methods to help them become incremental changes, that sort of drip feed. But we're also talking a week after the election. And I guess, you've got Keir Starmer and a new Labour government coming in who don't have that privilege of incremental change. It's change from day one, which is the complete juxtaposition of where an organisation like the Royal British Legion would sit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the interesting things that I've heard Keir Starmer and other ministers saying in the last few days is the kind of the emphasis that they're placing on delivery. I've heard Keir Starmer say, ministers will be judged on their delivery. I think there's something really in that, because again, charities spend a lot of time on vision, and that really matters. What are we aiming for? What kind of change do we want to affect? But ultimately, execution and delivery really matters. And so I think that's something I've learned in the last couple of jobs I've done. If I go back to my time at Scope, we spent a lot of time on strategy development and vision and the change that we want to see in the world. And actually, I probably didn't spend enough time thinking about, okay, so what's the kind of means of delivery? How are we going to get there? And Scope's doing brilliant work today, and I'm really proud of where I left that organisation. But I think one of the things that has been interesting in the last week is that real emphasis on execution and delivery. And look, I don't know if this is entirely right, but I think I've got to a place where I sort of feel like strategy vision is 20% and delivery and execution is 80%. And, going into this new exercise with the Royal British Legion, I mean, that's going to be the real focus is, yes, we need to get, alignment and specificity around vision and the impact we want to achieve. But, 4 times as important as that is how we're going to actually affect that, how we're going to make it happen. So, yeah, you're right. General election just a few days ago, so that there's something that we can definitely learn about that emphasis on delivery. I think just one other thing I'd say, I mean, we've had a busy general election campaign at the Royal British Legion, so lots of engagement with each of the political parties. We held events that were attended by senior spokespeople from all of the parties. We obviously produced our own manifesto. Just this week we've signed off a kind of a guide for new parliamentarians that have been elected to help them support the armed forces communities in their own constituencies. So, we've really worked hard to make sure that the interests and the needs, both of today's armed forces community And by that, we mean those that are serving veterans, families, and the bereaved, making sure that their interests are really kind of central to the public policy debates that we've been having, and we'll continue to do that with the new government.
Great stuff. So lots of threads to pull through there into the new strategy. So yeah, we'd love to hear how all of that goes as you get further into it. Coming back to that theme about change that you mentioned, and also that we talked about when we first spoke back in February, and that's appetite for change and I guess capability for change that more established organisations like RBL have, and also where you've done this previously at RNID and Scope as well. How do you determine that comfort level for change, and also perhaps that where an organisation can be stretched to change that little bit further as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, there is a sort of, fairly deep-rooted sort of small c conservatism that runs across quite a number of charities and charity boards. So it's a really fair question, which is, how do you support charities and in particular trustees to feel confident about change and to have sort of, an ability to make some big decisions. So look, I think it's a really fair question. I think there's a few things that I try and do in terms of kind of setting a good backdrop for those things. So the first is about, trying to place a big emphasis on evidence, because I think if you've got evidence and insight and data, actually people feel more comfortable in making decisions. I do think there are some examples of the charity sector sort of drifting more towards ideology and less towards evidence. And I think it's really important that we remain evidential, that we make decisions based on the needs and the data and the insights of the communities that we're here to support. And so I'm sort of naturally quite an analytical person. Like I place a big value and premium on that. So part of it is about having a good evidence base. So the conversation that I'll be having with my trustees in a couple of weeks' time, we'll start with a conversation on evidence. So what do we know about the armed forces community and how that community is changing? What are their current needs? What are their needs in the future? And the big challenge for RBL there in terms of that community is that as the national service generation passes away, the armed forces community becomes a whole lot smaller, and it becomes a whole lot more younger and more diverse. And so therefore, we've got to have a strategy that is, includes products and services and campaigns relevant to people of a working age. And, that's the big demographic shift. So I think, just returning to your question, Zoe, there's definitely something about, placing an emphasis on evidence and going into a sort of change program or a strategy development program with a big kind of focus on, what do we know about our customers, but also what evidence gaps have we got, and let's be honest about those and work out how we can respond to that. I think there's also something about, learning from others. Again, we're a bit patchy in this sector on this, but, I'm spending quite a bit of time looking at how the armed forces community are supported in other countries. What does it look like in other NATO countries? What does it look like in North America? How are that community of people who have served and their loved ones supported both throughout their time of active service, but also when they are veterans? So there's something about being curious and working out how common challenges and problems are responded to in other sectors or other territories, other countries, etc. So I think being evidential, being curious is really important stuff. And there's definitely more that we can do in that space. I think the other thing I would just say is, like, again, one of my reflections on change and kind of strategy development is, that the biggest determinant on whether organizations are successful tends to be about whether there are shared values amongst senior leaders, And so actually, I think, again, spending time early on, either as, an executive management team or as a board of trustees or both, talking about personal values and the values of the organization and kind of creating the climate in which you can have difficult conversations about the future and to kind of learn to disagree in a professional and mature way. That's really important, I think. And again, I've seen some brilliant examples of that happening and some not so great examples of that happening. But I think, creating the environment where that can happen is really important. I guess, the only final thing I would say is, ultimately, um, people have got to be prepared to make some decisions. And, I think there is a responsibility on trustees and on senior leaders in the charity sector to use the very short time that we often have leading these organisations to make long-term decisions that will hopefully preserve these organisations, into the future, but also make sure that they're going to be successful for the long term. So, that sort of small c conservatism, kind of, protect the donor base, don't rock things too much, keep things ticking over kind of mentality. Look, I just think that's very short-termist, because actually the world is changing very, very rapidly. And I just described the changing demographics of the armed forces community, but the same is true for lots of charities and the audiences they're working with. So the kind of, play it safe strategy really won't work in the kind of, conflicted, demanding, rapidly changing 21st century. The very best charities will be those that are, mature enough to make some big decisions about what to do. And, you'll know from my time at Scope, we made big choices there, about, the kind of organisation that we wanted to be. And, ultimately the organisation became a whole lot smaller in terms of the number of people it employed and the range of very different services and products that it offered. But it became a whole lot bigger in terms of the number of people that it was affecting and changing. And again, there is a kind of a culture in our sector of sort of measuring performance by, what's your turnover, how many people do you employ, what does your balance sheet look like? Actually, those shouldn't be the metrics in our sector. What we should be looking at is how many people are we reaching and how can we evidence the impact that we're making on their lives. And at Scope, the choice was, do we want to be a dynamic social change organisation that is driving change for disabled people, tackling the inequalities and the barriers that they face at a sort of mass market level for the millions of disabled people that exist in our country? Or do we want to be an organisation that's delivering really high quality statutory services to a small number of people? And that was a really legitimate debate. What was great about Scope is, back to what I was saying a second ago, the board had the confidence to make some decisions because there were shared values, because there was a strong evidence base, and because ultimately they wanted to preserve the charity for the long term. So they're the sorts of ingredients, I think, that you need if you're going to make a success of this.
There's so much there that you said that really resonates with me, and I'd like to take a moment just to unpack it a little bit, if that's
Sure.
okay. So firstly, your point about the sort of small c conservatism in some parts of the sector. This is fascinating because this theme really came up in a conversation we had a few episodes ago with Lucy Straker from Proud Changemakers, and how she really feels that when she walks into a room, particularly at sector events. And it's something that, I've really noticed as well. We're really sort of socially progressive sector where really exciting stuff happens. But yes, there is a bit of a strand of small c conservatism in parts of the sector. Why is that, do you think?
Good question. I mean, I think there are probably multiple reasons, but I think one of them is definitely the regulatory environment in which we operate. And, you and I, Zoe, we've talked about charity governance before, and for me, it feels like one of the kind of big unreformed bits of corporate governance. If you look at other sort of social purpose organisations, whether it's the NHS or housing associations or bits of local authorities, those organisations have been through a modernisation in terms of their governance and the regulatory environment. I'm not sure the charity sector has. It still feels to me somewhat Victorian, somewhat philanthropic in its sort of nature. And I wonder if that is a major contributory factor to this small c conservatism. I think there is a sort of enormous amount of pressure that is placed on trustees by the regulatory environment, where it states, all the duties that you as a trustee have, often as company directors as well. And I think that I wonder if that stifles innovation, if that stifles creativity, and if it kind of puts an emphasis on kind of keeping things broadly as they are, keeping things ticking over. I don't think we do a good job in regulatory terms of supporting trustees to innovate, to take risk, to think differently about how their charity might operate or the impact it might have. The emphasis is about keeping it safe, keeping it as it is, and things not blowing up on your watch. And I think there's much more that both the Charity Commission, but also, senior leaders like myself can do to support boards to kind of break that cycle. I think that does, that sort of slightly old-fashioned non-unitary board model. I think that does kind of culturally sort of drip down through organisations. And so, look, it's not the only reason why there's that small c conservatism, but I think it's quite a significant part of the challenge that we face. And I'm definitely up for disrupting that. So both in my current role, but also when I was at RNID, not in sort of legal entity terms, but culturally, trying to behave like we're a unitary board. That, the job of trustees is not to mark the homework of management, but the job of trustees is to add value, to challenge, to scrutinise, to be ambassadors. And that's, I've seen a lot of that really positive behaviour at RNID and more recently at the Royal British Legion. I want to see more of that across our sector, because I think if we can create a climate where there's a kind of a better appetite around risk and around innovation and creativity and doing things differently, and something's not working out, and that's okay because we're going to learn from it. Like that's a much more kind of healthy space for us to be in. And the big burning platform that lots of charity chief execs tell me that they're sort of grappling with is one of relevance, right? Of course, there's all sorts of challenges around money and staffing and all sorts of challenges, but the big sort of existential challenge is one of relevance. And that's certainly true for RBL. How do we take this organisation that's 103 years old and make it relevant to, hypothetically, a 34-year-old captain leaving the British Army today and going to get a job, a civilian job for the first time? What's our offer to that person as they transition from one world to another? And that is true for many, many charities. One of relevance, whether you are big or small, national or regional, many charities struggle to describe a modern, contemporary offer to the community that they're serving. And therefore, increasingly, many of these charities are irrelevant to the mass audience. They're reaching a proportion, but they're irrelevant to a mass audience. And I think that's the big challenge that many of us are facing. And I think, part of that has to be corporate governance and trusteeship that supports those sorts of debates. How do we make sure that organisations that were founded in the early part of the 20th century are as relevant today as they were then? That's really complicated. So, yeah, more work to do, I think.
And you describe that process of gathering the evidence and the insight and the data about how the external environment is changing, that your audience is changing, and using that almost as the rocket fuel to create the energy to move that strategy forward and shape it. With this challenge that you mentioned about relevance, which I really recognise across the sector, I see so many charities struggling with that at the moment. What are your initial thoughts on how you might go about tackling that at RBL?
Yeah, so look, we've got a really strong, capable in-house team that work both across campaigns, policy, research, but also around data and insight. So part of it is a kind of a map of what have we got today in terms of evidence and insight that we can draw on, but also what do we not have? What are the gaps that we need to kind of to better understand? And back to my earlier point, there's definitely an emphasis, I think, on looking at international examples as well as kind of what happens here in the UK. So I think just understanding kind of where you're at is really important in terms of your kind of customer or the community you're working with. One of the other interesting things that faces our sector, and this is definitely true in the kind of armed forces part of the charity sector, is the kind of proliferation of different organisations that exist. So when I joined, I was trying to piece together this ecosystem of armed forces charities. I think there's something like 1,700 armed forces charities and benevolent funds. And, RBL is the largest in that space, but it's by no means the expert in that space. It's one of many organisations doing really important work. So I think there's also something about just understanding the operating environment as well. Like, so who else is in this space? Who does what? What's their strategic focus? Because certainly if you're a sort of fairly sizable organisation in your kind of ecosystem, what we choose to do as our strategic direction is going to massively impact other organisations. And the same was true when I was at Scope. Lots of disability organisations locally, nationally, some of them impairment specific, some of them pan disability. What Scope chooses to focus on will impact other organisations. So part of it, yes, you've got to understand the customer and the community really well. But you've also got to understand the operating environment and the partner organisations, because they've got the same beneficiaries, for old kind of Victorian language, but they've got the same customers that you have, and therefore how you achieve charitable impact will determine how they achieve charitable impact. So I think that's also really important. But then I also think, just to kind of broaden the question out slightly, I also think the back to the conversation we had about pace is really important. How co-productive do you want to make your change? How co-productive do you want to make your strategy? And I think there's massive value in that. Clearly it will enrich the process by having more input from different stakeholders. But that shouldn't negate the need, as I said on a couple of occasions, for trustees to make decisions. And ultimately that is the job of the board, is to make some choices. So I do think evidence is really important. That's what we're doing at the moment, to kind of build up that kind of rich backdrop, that kind of context. And I guess the only other thing I would say is, I think it's really important that, as well as looking outside and being curious about, what do we know and what's out there, organisations have got to look in-house as well. And part of the journey I'll be taking my board on is to kind of really paint that picture of the very diverse range of things that the Royal British Legion does today, and ask ourselves some questions about which of those we do brilliantly well, which of those actually could possibly be done better by other organisations, or which activities could we do differently or scale or not. So, you have to be prepared to be honest about your own capability and how effective you are as an organisation at doing different things. And RBL is like RNID and Scope and many, many other charities, in that it does so many very, very different things, all under the one brand, all through the same operating model. And that's really challenging. And I think, the best strategies, whatever sector they're in, whatever organisation it's in, the best strategies tend to be the one where you can pick it up and read it and go, okay, I can see the choice they've made, and I can see the dominant 2 or 3 tasks they're really going to focus on. And that's where I want to take this organisation.
Can I just ask a quick question on that? And it might be coincidence, but one of the things you've said is, 5 years here, 5 years there, 5 years. The job of a CEO is to often come in, do a 5-year stint, and then review where you are and think, okay, have I done what I needed to do here? Is there another organisation I can go on and help? Do you think the same should be true of people that work within the organisation, but more specifically of trustees? Asking for a friend. But that sort of that view of the trustees that may have been around for a lot longer than that, maybe carrying a lot of the weight of history with them, and the opportunity for these strategy meetings to be one of renewal and recommitment. And this is the direction we want to go in. Are you the right person for the next 5 years?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think most large charities, indeed many smaller charities as well, I think have over the last sort of 10 to 20 years got into the practice of having fixed terms of office for trustees, so that you do get that turnover and that renewal, that there's new ideas and perspectives. It varies a little bit from organisation to organisation, doesn't it? So at Scope and RNID, trustees were elected or appointed on a 3-year term of office, a maximum of 2 terms, i.e. 6 years. Slightly longer at RBL, so it's 3 years times 3, up to a maximum of 9. But the point is, many organisations have adopted that practice of rotation, that this is not a job for life, that actually boards do need to be living kind of organisations with people coming and going with a range of different skills and expertise, and that diversity really matters at the top table. So I think that, that is sort of baked in, certainly to RBL and many other organisations. But, there is something to your broader kind of question, Paul, which is about, no one's bigger than the brand, right? No one's bigger than RBL. No one's bigger than Scope or Macmillan or any other organisation. So there is something about, in the sort of spirit of service, working out when, either as a trustee or as a senior leader, actually the organisation requires something different, and I need to free up this space. If I just share my own personal example of that, I was at Scope for 5 years, 3 years of which I was the chief exec. I led the development of their new strategy and their sort of fundamental repositioning, from being a deliverer of statutory care services primarily to being a campaigning and advocacy organisation. That was, heavy lifting, hard graft. It was emotional. It was a tough job. I knew that when I'd got through strategy and the transfer of those care services, that actually the organisation required a different chief exec, ironically called Mark, but like a different chief exec that could, build the next chapter of the organisation. Partly that's about kind of personal energy levels and scars on backs and all of those sorts of things. But it's also just recognising that organisations are living organisations in themselves, and they will need different skills and perspectives. I reached a really clear view in my own mind that having taken Scope on that journey, it needed a new chief executive to do the next chapter. And to some extent, the same was true at R&ID, slightly differently. But the work that Harriet's now doing as the chief exec there is taking the organisation to places that I wouldn't have been able to take it, and certainly at a pace that I wouldn't have been able to take it. So, there is something about knowing when to leave the stage, and I think that is true of trustees as well as of senior leaders, chief execs, etc. I mean, interestingly, at the Royal British Legion, so it's 103 years old, and I'm the 10th person to hold this job. So, there is a sort of a stickiness about people sort of staying for a significant period of time. And I think in part, look, it's a big and complex organisation. It does get under your skin, and there's lots to do. But there is a sort of trend of people staying for some time. I've always done these kind of 5-year stints, so maybe I'll do a bit longer this time. But there's something about knowing when you can add value, but also when actually organisations might or teams might benefit from a different perspective. And again, we're not naturally good at that. It's not something that's always as mature as you might want it to be in our sector.
Yeah, and it's tougher for smaller charities as well, isn't it? That probably
Completely.
do have an over-reliance on the same people coming out to do the same job time and time again, and not necessarily being able to renew in that way. So
I agree with that. I mean, I was a trustee for 6 years of a really small but very, very important charity called Prisoners Abroad, and they for the last 40 years have supported British citizens detained overseas, incarcerated overseas, and staff team of sort of 20-25 people, and trustees for who were sort of uber super volunteers in exactly the way that you describe. And to lose one or two of those at the same time was a major organisational risk, because they were so dependent on the sort of discretionary effort that those trustees and senior staff put into the organisation. So look, I completely agree with that.
And then one of the other things that we talked about, speaking of change, when we began this conversation a few months ago, was about what's happened in the sector post-lockdown. And obviously the sector going through this awful thing of going straight from lockdown into the cost of living crisis, tremendous demands on service delivery, all the scrutiny the sector has been under and probably will continue to be under, and how that is a really challenging environment for innovation across the sector overall. And we talked about how the sector, how it could potentially find that post-lockdown mojo was, I think, the phrase that you came up with, which I really liked. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, well, I guess not necessarily advice, but maybe a couple of thoughts. I mean, I agree. It has been an incredibly tough time, not just for kind of charities, but society at large, right? It has been incredibly difficult, and as somebody who's got young children that were out of school, and friends who are impacted from a kind of mental health perspective, it has been a strain on society at large, and obviously charities have experienced that, and the communities they're supporting have experienced that. I mean, I guess a couple of things that I would say, Zoe. So for me, there's definitely something, and I know I've kind of sound a bit like I'm repeating myself, but there is something about keeping focused on evidence and keeping focus on your customers and the communities you're supporting and working with, and making sure that you're pushing organisations to be responsive to their needs, I think is really important, because most of the people that I meet that work in our sector do so because they're really passionate. They want to make a profound difference to people's lives. and they get energy from delivering stuff, right? None of us are here for any other reasons. We could choose to work in different sectors if we had different motivations, but most people, get that sort of energy and that satisfaction and that momentum from delivering really good work. So there's something about just kind of keeping focused on delivery and making a difference to people's lives that I think is really important. I think part of the challenge on this sort of mojo piece is, look, we're all leading organizations that are like in flight. They're doing stuff today, and often they're doing brilliant stuff today. But being able to kind of carve some time out to think about the future in a kind of structured and sensible and thoughtful way, I find that really energizing, and I hope others do too. This idea that you want to spend time thinking about what innovation and creativity and difference might look like, and how do you get there, and how might you partner and work with other organizations differently. So I think there's something about how we all use our time, and that's obviously kind of a critical way I think that many of us get energy. And look, that is really important because the environment is changing really rapidly, and so no matter how hard you pedal trying to lead today's organization to be the best version of itself, you have to carve some time out to think about the future. So look, I think all of those things are really important. I think one of the big things that has changed over my time in the charity sector and has been accelerated through the pandemic that you were describing is the sort of changing nature of the workplace. And I can't help but think that is connected to this question about energy and mojo within our sector post-pandemic. Look, I don't know the answer. I've gone from R&ID where, we took a decision to become a digital first, home-based organisation with our staff working all across the UK, no core hours, uber flexible, into a different model. And the different model where we've got, some staff that are working from home, some staff that are working in an office, some staff that are hybrid. So, there is a challenge, I think, for organisations about making some choices around, how do you respond to increasing demands from a kind of a workforce around flexibility, many of which deliver benefits back into the business, back into the organisation, but at the same time wanting to kind of focus on performance and culture and that sense of belonging. And look, I think as leaders, we're all grappling with how do we get that right, and we're both doing stuff in our organisations today, but also looking at other organisations about how they're managing those things. R&ID has led a particular direction, which I was, an architect of making happen. It's not necessarily right for every organisation, including the Royal British Legion. But, in defence of R&ID, they've made a choice and they've created a culture and an operating model around that. And what I'm going to do at the Royal British Legion is work out what's right for this organisation and how we kind of move forward on that. But alongside the kind of physical dimension of where are people and how do you create a culture and a sense of belonging, the kind of changing expectations more generally of people entering the labour market and entering work is really different to when I started working, 180 years ago, whatever it was. That sort of sense of right to consultation, right to engagement, those are very strongly held views, particularly amongst younger people coming into the charity sector who are typically values-driven, massively passionate people that want to shift the dial on whatever the causes of the charity. And what comes with that is a real challenge around what contemporary leadership looks like. How do I talk to people? How do I tell a story? How do I manage performance? How do I celebrate success? All of that, I think, has been massively disrupted in the last 5 years, partly because of pandemic and people's sort of ways of working, but partly just because a younger workforce, people in their first, second, third jobs expect a lot more and different from people who've been in the work environment for some time. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure if there is an answer, but it's a common challenge when I speak to other charity chief execs as to how do you grapple that? How do you, harness the talent and the energy, but also how do you think about the very best ways to lead and to motivate and to challenge the people with you? So look, you're right. I mean, the sector, I choose to work in this sector because I want to make a profound difference to the world in which I live. That's why I've spent the last 25 years working for different charities. And it's the only sector I've worked in. and I get energy from, making a difference and from shifting the dial on stuff. And I think the sector has struggled in recent years because it's been really tough, and as you say, you come out of the pandemic and you go into cost of living, and cost of living had a sort of, double impact on charities because it drove up need and demand. And we saw that in terms of the kind of cost of living and energy support that we provided the armed forces community. So demand grows, but actually there's real pressure on income and financial sustainability. So you're kind of being squeezed at both ends. And I know lots and lots of charities have kind of experienced that. And look, the only thing I would say, which again you and I have talked about, Zoe, is despite all of that, which sounds a bit gloomy, my experience is that many of these charities are far more resilient than you might give them credit for. There is an inherent kind of resilience there. People, supporters, volunteer staff are often incredibly loyal to the brand and to the organisation that they are supporting. And therefore, whether it's strategy or organisational change or kind of macroeconomic challenges that are impacting on charities and their supporters and communities, these charities typically, not always, I accept, but typically do manage to navigate that brilliantly well. And the number of charity chief execs I've spoken to who talk about the innovation and the difference that came out of the pandemic, because they were forced to do things differently and to think differently about engagement or service delivery or hiring or whatever it may be. So there is something about, in moments of real challenge, those crises can be actually sometimes really helpful in terms of pushing organisations to be different. And hopefully, we'll come out of the latest challenges and find the mojo that we've been talking about.
I really love the way you've described that, Mark, because what you say there is what Paul and I are seeing in the different sectors we work in every day. It's that thing of post-lockdown, mid-flight and the cost of living crisis. So many organisations' cultures are redefining themselves, and yet we're almost scared to give that a name because there is a bit of a power struggle at the heart of that. And your point there about perhaps a bit of intergenerational tension or different kind of power tension as well. And I find it really exciting working with some of the younger leaders who are coming into the sector now, and they're asking questions like, well, why are we doing it this way? Or even, I'm not doing it this way because it doesn't make any sense to do that. But I can absolutely see how if you were someone who had a more traditional idea of what power and leadership was, that would feel unsettling. And this is all going to continue to unwind, isn't it, over the next few years? So I think the way you've described that's absolutely bang on.
Yeah, well, I agree, and look, as I say, I'm not sure there is an answer, but we're all kind of sharing our reflections on this. It is a common challenge that is spanning sectors and industries and territory. Like this is a sort of global sort of phenomenon that we're all trying to get our heads around. I think, having done 3 chief exec roles in 3 quite different organisations, Scope, RNID, and now with the Royal British Legion, the one thing that I've definitely experienced is a kind of a growing expectation and demand almost amongst staff, volunteers, supporters, for visibility of leaders, for leaders to be vulnerable, to be open, to be prepared to kind of take risks, to acknowledge failures, to kind of create a culture in which people learn and have that kind of open growth mindset piece. Like, I'm not sure if I go back 20 years when I was working for charity chief execs, that was as pronounced. There has definitely been a kind of a cultural shift, I think accelerated by the pandemic and other sort of macro challenges, where people quite understandably now expect chief executives to tell the story, to be visible, to be accountable, to be able to ask and answer questions, and to be open and honest about who they are and their own vulnerabilities. I think all of that is a good thing. I think it makes organisations stronger, and I think it creates a culture and a climate where everybody feels they can bring their whole self to work. That's good, but it's unquestionably a sort of seismic shift that has happened and is continuing to happen. And the charity sector is values driven. It should be focused and orientated around mission. We should feel most comfortable with this, but nonetheless, there's a big pressure that's there and that we need to kind of respond to.
Yeah, absolutely. So watch this space. The future's coming and we all need to plan for it. Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. This has been incredibly thought-provoking, so fascinating to hear how your time at RBL is going and how you've tackled change previously. And we're super excited to hear how everything goes with the new strategy and everything else. So please do keep in touch and we hope you'll come back again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Mark for making the time to come on to Starts at the Top and share his experiences with us. It was a great conversation that we both really enjoyed, I think.
Very much so. Thank you very much to Mark. Some really interesting reflections there on leadership and what the sector needs to think about, what it needs to do differently, what it needs to consider in terms of where governance goes as well. So thank you very much to Mark, and thank you for listening, everyone.
Yeah, as always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you very much. You can support our podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share us with a friend. We should do more of a campaign on getting reviews, because all the podcasts seem to be asking for reviews, and we do ask, but we're very gentle about it.
Yes, please do leave us a review if you've enjoyed what you've heard. And thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.
Bye for now.